He'll never be more than average. The words sliced through the rain-soaked darkness like a blade finding bone. I stood paralyzed outside my own workshop, rain hammering my shoulders, watching through the salt-stained window as my wife Alara laughed with a stranger in an expensive suit. Her hand rested on my unfinished boat, the one I'd been building in secret for months, and her voice carried that particular cruelty reserved for punchlines. Look at this pathetic thing. Tomas actually believes handmade boats will save us from poverty. The stranger's polite laughter mixed with thunder. My fingers tightened around the wooden box I'd carved for her birthday, 3 weeks of dawn-hour work before she woke. Inside was a seashell pendant with our initials intertwined in cherry wood grain. Average, she repeated, savoring the word like poison. A 42-year-old carpenter who works for free while we drown in debt. I deserve so much more than this. The box fell from my numb hands, splitting open on wet concrete. The pendant shattered into pieces I'd never repair. Something deeper broke too. My name is Tomas Harwell. 20 years ago, I arrived in Saltmere with nothing but calloused hands and my father's old tools, the only things that survived when the sea took him. The town adopted me the way small places do, feeding me, teaching me, giving me purpose when grief had hollowed me out completely. I learned to build boats the traditional way, with patience and hand tools, because my father's voice still whispered in the grain of every piece of wood I touched. Alara came into my life like summer lightning, sudden and electric, all wild curls and bigger dreams than our fishing town could contain. She'd watch me work for hours back then, calling my hands magic, saying I could carve beauty from nothing. We married young, drunk on promises neither of us understood how to keep. But somewhere between then and now, her dreams outgrew the life I could build. The laughter that once filled our home became bitter, her warmth replaced by cold disappointment that pressed against my chest like drowning. Saltmere existed in the forgotten spaces between tourist destinations, a working harbor where fishing boats limped home each dawn, nets torn and bodies exhausted. I knew every weathered face on these docks, every story written in scars and sun damage. Old Phineas would raise his coffee cup each morning from his boat's deck, his nets always split from fighting the sea's temper. I'd repair them during lunch breaks, my hands moving through familiar patterns while he told stories about the catch. Last month, the butcher's 7-year-old daughter Penny broke her toy chest, the one her late mother made. She cried like the world was ending. I built her a new one in 3 nights, carving dolphins along the sides because she'd told me once they were magic. When I delivered it, she hugged my legs so tight I thought my heart might crack open. "You fixed Mama's chest," she whispered. These moments were my real wages, though Alara saw only wasted time and unpaid labor. That night, I came home to find Alara wearing silk I'd never seen before, deep crimson that probably cost more than our overdue mortgage payment. She stood in our kitchen radiating contempt, her eyes scanning me like I was something that had washed up dead on shore. "Another day fixing junk for people who can't pay you." Her words landed like stones. I pulled the seashell pendant from my pocket, the replacement I'd carved after breaking the first. Months of stolen early mornings, each groove smoothed with patience and love I still stupidly harbored. "I made this for your birthday," I said, holding it out. She glanced at it the way someone might regard a dead insect, her lip curling. "Another useless trinket?" "Seriously, Tomas?" She didn't even touch it, just turned away. "You're wasting your life on things that don't matter. On people who don't matter." Her heels clicked toward the bedroom. "Including me, apparently." I stood alone in the kitchen I'd built with these worthless hands, the pendant warm in my palm, and carved until dawn. 3 mornings later, an old man appeared at the docks while I was sanding my secret project, a small wooden vessel I rebuilt in the purple hours before sunrise. He moved slowly, deliberately, with hands that told decades of stories in their scars and bent fingers. Silver hair escaped from beneath his wool cap, and his eyes held something I couldn't name, ancient and knowing. "Morning," he said, his voice like stones tumbling in surf. "Name's Vale. Mind some company?" I gestured to an empty crate, and he lowered himself with the careful movements of someone who'd learned to negotiate with aging bones. We didn't speak at first. I offered him tea from my battered thermos, and he wrapped both hands around the cup like it was something precious. "You mend things you don't own," he observed eventually, nodding toward Phineas's nets drying nearby. "Why spend your time on other people's problems?" I paused, considering the weight behind his simple question. "Because someone once fixed me when I was broken," I answered. "This town put me back together piece by piece." Vale smiled, and it felt like passing some test I hadn't known I was taking. Vale returned the next dawn with his shoe sole flapping loose, leather torn beyond what walking should cause. Before he could say anything, I was already reaching for my kit, the one I kept for emergency repairs on boats but worked just as well on anything that needed mending. I stitched the leather carefully, reinforcing weak points, making it stronger than new. When I tried to hand it back, he pressed coins into my palm, warm from his pocket. I shook my head and closed his fingers back around them. "Keep it," I said firmly. "You'll need it more than me." Something shifted in his expression then, like recognition or maybe satisfaction, emotions moving beneath the surface like fish in deep water. "Not many fix things without expecting something back," he murmured, more to the sea than me. The sunset painted everything crimson and gold, turning the harbor into liquid fire. Vale stood slowly, testing his repaired shoe, then looked at me with those strange, ancient eyes. "You're a rare man, Tomas Harwell," he said. Then he walked away, his shadow stretching impossibly long across the dock, and I felt like everything had just changed in ways I couldn't possibly understand yet. The storm building in my marriage finally broke on a Thursday afternoon. Elara exploded into my workshop like a hurricane, waving papers that fluttered and snapped in her fury. "We're drowning, Tomas." Her voice cracked with rage and something darker, maybe desperation. "The mortgage is 4 months behind. We're getting foreclosure notices, and you're out here playing with wood scraps like a child." She hurled the debt notices onto my workbench, scattering sawdust and scattered my tools. The numbers made my stomach drop, worse than I'd imagined. But before I could speak, before I could promise to fix it somehow, she was already launching into her familiar litany of my failures, my stubbornness, my pathetic inability to think bigger than this dying town. I reached into my back pocket with shaking hands and pulled out the envelope I'd received that morning. "The Harbor Festival," I said quietly, "they invited me to display my work. They think people might actually buy some pieces." Elara stared at the invitation like I'd handed her garbage. Then she laughed, sharp and ugly. "A festival? Selling carved fish to tourists? That's your grand solution?" She crumpled the letter without reading it, threw it at my chest. "That won't save us. Nothing you do will ever be enough." I went to the Harbor Festival alone, setting up my booth between a woman selling handmade soap and a teenager painting shells with glitter. Nothing special, nothing that screamed success or vindication. But within an hour, something unexpected happened. Children started gathering, drawn to my carvings like tied to shore, their small fingers tracing wooden dolphins and seahorses with wonder I'd forgotten existed. Parents smiled, really smiled, and bought pieces while telling me their kids would treasure these forever. A small boy with gap teeth and freckles asked how I made the wood so smooth. I knelt to his level, seeing myself at his age. With time, I told him honestly. And patience. And caring about every single curve like it matters, because it does. His mother bought 3 carvings and promised to return next month. By sunset, I'd sold more than I'd dared hope, though it still wouldn't save us from foreclosure. But something else happened that day, something harder to measure. Strangers saw value in work my own wife dismissed as worthless. Maybe that meant something. Maybe I wasn't as average as she'd convinced me I was. The next morning, Vale's bench sat empty, just weathered wood and morning shadows where he should have been. A folded paper waited there, weighted by a smooth black stone that caught the light like obsidian. My name was written across the front in handwriting that shook but carried intention in every letter. Inside, I found coordinates written with careful precision and a single line that made my breath catch, for the one who builds with heart. My hands trembled holding it. I stared out at the endless gray ocean, at waters that had taken my father and shaped my entire life, trying to decode what this meant. The coordinates pointed north along the coast, maybe 2 hours by boat into waters I didn't know well. Was this real? A treasure hunt? Some old man's final joke before disappearing? I stood frozen for 20 minutes, the note fluttering in the salt breeze, torn between curiosity and Alara's voice in my head calling me foolish for chasing fantasies. But something about Vale's knowing eyes, the way he'd watched me work, pulled at me like current impossible to resist. The sea had taken everything once. Maybe it was finally ready to give something back. Or maybe I was just desperate enough to believe I deserved more than the word average. That evening, I walked into our house and found Alara's suitcases stacked by the door like accusations. She stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed, face set hard as stone, already gone even though her body remained. "I'm leaving tomorrow for the city," she announced without looking at me. "Maybe when you're eating dinner alone, you'll finally understand that kindness doesn't pay bills." I wanted to fight, to beg, to fall to my knees and promise I'd change everything. But the words died in my throat because some part of me recognized the truth: she'd left months ago, I just hadn't wanted to see it. "I found that old beggar's note," she continued, her voice dripping contempt. "What, he left you a treasure map? How pathetically desperate can you be?" She laughed, but it sounded hollow, echoing in the space between us. "This is who you are, Tomas. A man who chases fantasies while real life crumbles." She moved toward the door, then paused. "You'll die in this town, average and alone, and nobody will remember you existed." The door slammed with such force that the windows rattled and the walls seemed to shudder. I stood frozen in our kitchen, surrounded by furniture I'd built with love, in a house that suddenly felt like a tomb. Outside, thunder rolled in from the sea, promising storms. I made my decision at dawn, in that purple hour when the world holds its breath between darkness and light. If Alara thought I was chasing fantasies, then I'd follow those fantasies to their end and finally know for certain what I was worth. I spent the morning preparing my small boat, checking every plank and seal with the thoroughness my father taught me, loading supplies I might need for wherever these coordinates led. The numbers pointed north into open water, towards something unknown and probably foolish. As I pushed off from the dock, Phineas called out, asking where I was headed. Following something, I called back, because I had no better explanation. Maybe following myself. The ocean opened before me like a question without answers, endless gray water beneath endless gray sky. Each wave rocked the boat gently, a rhythm I'd known since childhood, the same rhythm that had lulled me to sleep and woken me to purpose. I hummed an old sailing song my father taught me, the same one he'd sung the morning the sea kept him forever. Hours passed, and doubt crept in with the cold. What was I doing? Chasing coordinates from a stranger while my marriage died and my home faced foreclosure? But something deeper than logic kept my hands steady on the tiller, a feeling I couldn't name but refused to ignore. The coordinates led me to a hidden cove I'd never seen in 20 years of sailing these waters, tucked behind a rocky outcrop that made it invisible from any normal route. As I rounded the bend, my breath caught. The beach was alive with people, dozens of them, building wooden boats of every size. Volunteers moved with purpose and joy, sawing, sanding, hammering, their voices carrying across the water. A banner stretched between two posts read, "Coastal Relief Initiative, Building Hope." I anchored my boat and waded to shore, feeling like I'd stumbled into some dream or alternate reality where my skills actually mattered. A woman with paint-stained hands and a bright smile greeted me. "You here to help?" Before I could explain about Vale, about the coordinates, about not knowing why I was here, I found myself holding tools and working alongside strangers who welcomed me like I'd always belonged. The boats were for disaster relief, someone explained, meant to deliver supplies to storm-ravaged villages up the coast where roads had been destroyed. My hands moved automatically, measuring and cutting and joining wood with precision earned through decades. Within hours, people started noticing, gathering to watch, asking questions about my techniques that I answered without thinking. On the second day, the project foreman approached me during lunch. His name was Quillen, a man with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, carrying himself with the authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime building things that mattered. "You're not from around here," he stated, studying me carefully. "Why are you helping?" The question carried weight, like he was asking something deeper than my surface motivations. I shrugged, unsure how to explain the note, the coordinates, the desperate need to prove to myself that I wasn't just average, that my hands could create something beyond disappointment. "Because someone needs it," I answered simply. "And because I can." Quillen watched me for a long moment, then handed me a piece of timber so warped and twisted it looked beyond salvation. "Fix this," he said. "If you're as good as you seem." I took the wood, running my fingers along the grain, feeling where it wanted to bend and where it would break if forced. I worked for 3 hours, steaming, pressing, coaxing the wood back into something useful and beautiful through patience rather than power. When I finished, Quillen examined it closely, turning it over in his scarred hands. His expression softened into something like respect. "We've been waiting months for someone like you," he said quietly. "Someone who understands that wood has memory, that you can't force it, only guide it back to what it was meant to be." I didn't understand the weight of those words then. During lunch breaks, the volunteers talked in hushed, almost reverent tones about the mysterious benefactor funding the entire relief project. "He used to sit right there," someone said, pointing to a weathered chair positioned near the shore with a perfect view of all the work. My heart stuttered. The chair looked familiar, shaped like the one I'd sometimes seen Vale sitting in at different spots along the docks. "Old man, barely spoke," another volunteer added. "Just watched us work with this smile, like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't." I approached the chair slowly, feeling pulled toward it. There, carved into the armrest where only someone sitting would notice, were initials worn smooth by weather and time, V.H. Vale Harwell. My surname. My father's name. Impossible. My father drowned 20 years ago, and he'd never mentioned having a brother. But as I traced those letters with trembling fingers, pieces started falling into place. The way Vale had watched me work with knowing eyes. His strange comments about fixing without reward. The test with his torn shoe. The coordinates. Had he been searching for someone? For me specifically? Had my father's brother somehow found me after 2 decades, testing me, preparing me for something I couldn't yet understand? I looked out at the ocean, the same waters connecting his empty bench to this hidden cove, and felt the weight of something much larger than myself pressing down like deep water. On the 4th day, a news crew arrived in a van marked Channel 7 Local Stories, disrupting the peaceful rhythm of hammers and saws. The reporter was a young woman named Ingrid with intelligent eyes and energy that seemed almost aggressive. She wanted to film the humanitarian project, she explained, to share this story of community and hope. I immediately tried to disappear, focusing on sanding a hole at the far end of the beach, keeping my head down and my hands busy. But Quillen had other ideas. "Film him," he told Ingrid, pointing directly at me with a certainty that made my stomach drop. "That man there. That's the craftsmanship we're talking about, the heart of this whole project." I started to protest, but Ingrid was already approaching with her cameraman and microphone, smiling like she'd found exactly what she'd been looking for. "Just keep working naturally," she encouraged, positioning the camera. "We want to show real people doing real good, authentic humanity." So I sanded while they filmed, my hands moving through patterns I'd repeated 10,000 times, trying to ignore the lens. Ingrid asked questions about my technique, my philosophy, why I'd volunteered for this project. I answered honestly, simply, never imagining anyone beyond this beach would care about a carpenter's thoughts on wood and purpose and fixing what was broken. 200 miles away in a city she couldn't afford, Ilara sat in an upscale cafe pretending she belonged there. The coffee cost $8, the apartment listings on her phone all required deposits she didn't have, and the silk dress that looked so sophisticated in Saltmere felt cheap here among real wealth. The television mounted on the wall played the local evening news, background noise she'd been ignoring. Then she heard it: carpenter revives ancient craft to aid storm victims. Something made her look up, and there I was, filling the screen with my calloused hands and patient movements. The reporter's voice described me as a master craftsman inspiring hope through handmade boats and selfless dedication to communities in crisis. They showed me teaching a young girl how to sand with the grain, my voice gentle, my face lit with purpose Alara hadn't seen in years. Strangers in the cafe applauded. The owner turned up the volume. Someone said, "That's what humanity looks like." Ilara's coffee cup trembled in her hands, liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. She forced a smile when other patrons glanced her way, but inside, something fundamental was cracking. The man she'd called average, the man she'd abandoned for being too small, was being celebrated by hundreds, maybe thousands. And she was alone in an overpriced cafe, pretending, drowning in the same debt she'd blamed him for. The next morning, I was helping seal the hull of our largest boat when someone called my name in a voice I knew too well. I turned to find Alara picking her way across the sand, her city shoes completely wrong for the beach, her carefully styled hair already falling apart in the salt breeze. "Tomas," she breathed, reaching me. "You did all this? Built all these boats?" Her voice carried genuine shock and something else I couldn't identify, maybe regret. I nodded politely, keeping physical and emotional distance between us. The other volunteers greeted her warmly, assuming she was a supporter or perhaps my proud wife coming to surprise me. If they only knew the truth. A small girl named Kessa ran up then, tugging my sleeve with fingers still sticky from breakfast. "Mr. Tomas, the hero's boat is finished. Come see what we named it." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and several other children joined in, pulling me toward the water's edge where our largest vessel sat ready for launch. I glanced back at Alara, standing alone among the celebration, her face a complicated mixture of emotions I no longer cared to decode. She looked lost, like a stranger at a party where everyone knew the guest of honor intimately except her. For the first time, I saw clearly how little she actually knew about who I was, who I'd always been beneath her disappointment. That afternoon, after the children finally released me, Quillen approached holding an envelope sealed with old-fashioned wax, the kind nobody used anymore. "This was left for you," he said, pressing it into my hands. "Found it in Vale's chair this morning, weighted down with a stone." My hands shook as I broke the seal, making the wax crack and scatter. Inside, the handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. "Tomas, you've completed what I couldn't finish. The kindness you showed me was the final test. I've been searching for 3 years for someone worthy to lead this project, someone who builds not for glory or recognition but for others, for the pure purpose of fixing what's broken. You are that person. The foundation is yours now. Use it well. You have your father's hands and heart. Vale Harwell." My vision blurred with tears I hadn't cried since my father's funeral. Attached to the letter was a legal document naming me as the new head craftsman of the Harwell Foundation, established to preserve traditional boat building and provide disaster relief worldwide. The salary listed was more than I'd made in the last 5 years combined. But that wasn't what made me sink to my knees in the sand. It was the surname. Vale Harwell. My father's older brother, the uncle who disappeared into grief after failing to save his brother from the sea, who my father mentioned only once in stories heavy with loss. The man had found me, tested me, and given me everything including the chance to finally understand my own worth. Alara found me that evening sitting alone on the beach, the documents clutched in my shaking hands, watching the sun paint the water with colors that looked like fire. She sat beside me without asking permission, and for a long moment we just existed in the same space, listening to waves that didn't care about our drama. Finally, she spoke, her voice cracking in ways I'd never heard before. "I was wrong about you, Tomas." Tears streamed down her face, genuine this time, not the manipulative kind I'd learned to recognize. "I wanted so much more from life, but you were already everything. You were already more than I deserved, and I was too blind to see it. She reached for my hand. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I looked at her, this woman I'd loved desperately for years, and felt nothing but quiet, resigned sadness, like watching something beautiful die that had already been dead for months. We can't carve love out of shame, I said gently, pulling my hand away. You don't actually love me, Elara. You love who I became when other people finally noticed. You love the version of me that proves you weren't completely wrong to marry me. She started to protest, but I stood, brushing sand from my pants. I hope you find what you're looking for, I told her honestly. But it isn't here. It never was. I walked away down the beach, leaving her sobbing in the sand, and felt lighter than I had in years, like I'd been carrying stones and finally set them down. The foundation held an official ceremony the following week to announce the project's expansion and my new position. News crews from 3 different stations filled the beach with cameras and lights, turning our quiet workspace into something public and overwhelming. Volunteers I'd worked beside for days cheered as Quillen presented me with a wooden plaque carved with my name and the words, "Builder of Hope," in letters that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. They asked me to give a speech. I stood before the cameras, microphone in hand, looking out at faces I recognized and many I didn't, feeling exposed and terrified. But when I spoke, the words came from someplace deep and true. I only fixed what was broken, I said simply, my voice steady despite my shaking hands. That's all any of us can do. Find what's broken in this world and fix it, piece by piece, without expecting recognition or reward. That's the only thing that matters. The crowd fell completely silent, the weight of those simple words settling over everyone like snow. In the back, I saw Elara standing apart from the others, tears streaming down her face, her hands pressed to her mouth. But I wasn't speaking to her anymore. I was speaking to the version of myself who'd believed the lie that I was average, who'd let someone else's disappointment become my identity. That Tomas was gone now, replaced by someone who finally understood his own worth had never depended on being seen. After the ceremony, as volunteers were packing equipment and the news crews were conducting final interviews, a man in an expensive suit approached me with the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. His name was Caldwell, and he represented a manufacturing company specializing in marine products. "Mr. Harwell," he said, shaking my hand with practiced firmness, "we want to mass-produce your boat designs. I'm prepared to offer you a very generous contract." He showed me paperwork with numbers that made my head spin, profit projections that would make me genuinely wealthy. I looked down at my hands, at the calluses earned through decades of patient work. These hands knew every grain of wood intimately, understood that each piece required different treatment, that beauty came from attention and care impossible to replicate with machines. I thought about what mass production meant: speed, efficiency, profits, and soul being the first casualty. If I sell my hands, I asked quietly, what will I use to help others? Caldwell looked confused, like I'd spoken a foreign language. You could help far more people with the profits, he argued. But he didn't understand that the helping wasn't in the finished product. It was in the making, the teaching, the passing on of something that mattered. "Thank you," I said, "but no." I walked away from more money than I'd ever imagined having, and felt no regret whatsoever. Purpose, I'd finally learned, was worth infinitely more than comfort. 2 days later, I found a note on my workbench, held down by a piece of sea glass that caught the morning light like it was glowing from within. Elara's handwriting was shaky, less controlled than I'd ever seen it. "I'm leaving for good this time. The city, maybe farther. I need to figure out who I am without you being the person I blame for everything wrong in my life. I hope someday you can forgive me for not seeing you clearly, for not understanding that being ordinary was never your problem, it was mine. You were always more than I deserved." I read it twice, then carefully folded the paper. I walked to the old workshop where we'd built our first boat together years ago, back when we were young and believed in the same dreams. That boat was still there, forgotten in a corner, gathering dust and spider webs. I cleaned it carefully, replaced the worn boards that had rotted with time, and carved both our names in the hull, along with the years we'd spent together, good and bad. At sunset, I carried it to the water alone and pushed it out toward the horizon. It bobbed on the waves, silhouetted against the orange sky, carrying our entire history away from shore. I watched until I couldn't see it anymore, until it became just another shadow on the vast ocean. Then I turned back toward land, toward the workshop full of students waiting to learn, toward a future I was building with my own hands. 3 weeks later, an international news crew contacted the foundation. They'd heard about the carpenter who built hope and wanted to do a feature story for a program about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The segment aired across multiple countries, showing our work, our philosophy, our boats carrying supplies to grateful communities still recovering from disasters. Letters began arriving from around the world, so many we needed boxes to contain them. Donations poured in faster than we could count. Children sent drawings of boats with my name written in crayon, saying they wanted to build like me when they grew up. A school in Finland incorporated our techniques into their woodworking program. An elderly woman in Japan wrote to say watching me work reminded her of her late husband, a shipwright who believed in the same patient craft, who died believing nobody cared about the old ways anymore. I kept every letter, reading them on quiet evenings when doubt still tried to creep back in, when Alara's voice whispered that I was foolish for choosing purpose over profit. Somewhere across the ocean, I heard through mutual friends, Alara watched the international broadcast from a small apartment she was cleaning houses to afford. She cried, they said, but not from sadness anymore. From something stranger, harder to name, pride mixed with regret, understanding what she'd walked away from, seeing clearly what she'd actually lost, finally recognizing that average had never been my problem. With the foundation's resources and growing support, I opened a free workshop for anyone who wanted to learn traditional boat building, no experience or payment required. My first students were an unlikely collection, orphans from the local shelter who needed purpose, young people who'd aged out of foster care with nowhere to go, dreamers dismissed by a world obsessed with speed and instant results, old men who wanted to remember skills they'd abandoned for steadier paychecks decades ago. I taught them the same way my father taught me, with patience and stories, showing them that wood had memory and spirit, that you couldn't force beauty but only coax it out with care and attention. The workshop filled with laughter and sawdust, the smell of cedar and fresh varnish, hands learning to create instead of destroy. Ingrid from Channel 7 came back to film a follow-up story. "What changed you?" she asked, microphone ready, camera rolling. I paused, thinking about Vale's test, about Alara's cruel words, about the moment I'd realized my worth couldn't be measured in someone else's satisfaction or disappointment. "Nothing changed," I said finally, smiling at my students working behind me. "People just finally saw what was always there. I didn't become something different. The world just started paying attention." The students nodded, understanding something they'd learned through wood and time, that being seen doesn't change your value, it only changes how others value you. At sunset, I sat in Vale's chair at the beach's edge, carving a small wooden compass rose for a student who'd asked me to teach her navigation. Behind me, dozens of boats floated in the harbor, each one built by my students' hands, each one carrying their hopes and newfound skills out into the world. Tomorrow they'd paint their names on the hulls, claiming ownership of something they'd created with patience and care nobody had taught them they possessed. The waves rolled in with their eternal rhythm, the same rhythm that had comforted me through darkness, that had carried away my pain and brought me here to this moment. I thought about Alara's words, "You'll never be more than average." She was right, in a way she'd never intended or understood. I was average in all the ways that didn't matter to her, money, status, ambition for things that disappeared. But in the ways that actually mattered, in kindness and patience and quiet determination to fix what was broken, I discovered I was exactly what the world needed. Not because I'd changed or grown or become someone different, but because I'd finally stopped believing the lie that I needed to be anything other than myself. "Kindness doesn't vanish," I whispered to the darkening water, to Vale's memory, to the ghost of my father still sailing these waves. "It just multiplies, spreading out like ripples until you can't see where it started anymore." The horizon glowed gold with dying light, the same place where my doubt had begun, now marking the beginning of something I'd built with these average, extraordinary hands that had never been the problem. They'd been the solution all along.